She didn't flinch when Colonel Harwick read the order aloud. She just stood there, hands at her sides, eyes fixed on a point somewhere past his left shoulder, and let the words land the way they always landed, like something that had been decided long before anyone bothered to say it out loud. Specialist Maren Solis is hereby removed from Sniper Integration Program candidacy, effective immediately. Reason: candidate deemed a non-cohesive unit risk. Non-cohesive unit risk, that was the language they used. Not failed, not unqualified. Those words would have required proof. Non-cohesive unit risk was bureaucratic fog. It meant whatever the man signing the form needed it to mean, and in this case, it meant that Major Dex Calloway had made a decision 3 weeks before the final evaluation and was now doing the paperwork to catch up with it. Maren knew it. Harwick probably knew it. The 2 junior officers standing in the back of the room definitely knew it. None of that changed anything. She saluted, said yes, sir, and walked out. What she did not do, and this is the thing that people who weren't there will never fully understand, what she did not do was look back. The Sniper Integration Program had been Calloway's project from the beginning. He'd built it from a pilot program into something that now carried genuine institutional weight. A 12-week pipeline designed to identify soldiers who could function as precision assets embedded with special operations teams, not just shooters, calculators, people who could read wind, elevation, distance, and human behavior simultaneously, then make a shot that altered the outcome of an entire mission without anyone outside a half-mile radius ever knowing it happened. It was, by any metric, exactly the kind of program Maren Solis had been born to complete. She had a degree in applied mathematics from Carnegie Mellon that she'd finished in 3 years. She'd scored in the 99th percentile on the Army's spatial reasoning and ballistics aptitude assessment, a test that most candidates took twice before passing and that 2 candidates in the current cohort had failed outright. Her qualification scores at week 4 had been the highest in program history, not the highest among women. The highest period across the 11 years the program had been running in its current form. Calloway's problem with Maren was not her ability. He understood her ability perfectly well. His problem was something older and smaller and harder to name. The kind of thing that lives in men who have spent their entire careers in rooms where they were always the most capable person present, and who have organized a significant portion of their identity around that fact. She made him uncomfortable, and men like Calloway, when made uncomfortable, do not examine the discomfort. They eliminate its source. What he did not account for, what he could not have accounted for, because it required knowing Maren in a way he'd never bothered to, was that she had been expecting this, not hoping for it, not assuming it, but she'd read the architecture of what he was building against her clearly enough that somewhere around week 6, she'd made a quiet decision of her own. She started keeping records, not dramatically, not as an act of rebellion, more the way a mathematician keeps notes, systematically, without emotion, because incomplete data is useless data, and you never know which variable is going to matter. She noted the dates when her range scores were recorded with a 24-hour delay while male candidates' scores posted in real time. She noted the 3 instances when Calloway's second, a captain named Breck, had verbally corrected her form in front of the group using measurements that were, by her calculation, wrong, and she documented the correct figures in her personal log with timestamps. She noted the session where she was assigned a rifle with a scope that had been knocked out of 0, fired 3 shots that grouped poorly, and was told the result reflected inconsistent fundamentals. She'd asked to inspect the rifle afterward. Breck had said no. She documented that too. She noted the week 9 evaluation where she shot a 94.7, the second highest score in the cohort, and the official record listed it as 91.2. She said nothing at the time. She wrote down both numbers, the one she'd earned and the one that appeared in the system, and she moved on. By week 11, she had 43 separate entries. By the morning Harwick read her the dismissal order, she had 47. The thing about Calloway's plan, and it was a plan, even if he never called it that, even if he thought of it only as the way things needed to go, the thing about it was that it required everyone around him to remain passive. It required the junior officers to look at their boots. It required Harwick to sign the paperwork without asking too many questions. It required Maren to accept the outcome and disappear. It had worked before. It had worked twice before, with candidates whose names you won't find in any official record of the program, because the program's official record was maintained by the same office that processed the dismissal orders. What Calloway hadn't accounted for was Sergeant First Class Dov Resnick. Resnick had been a range instructor for 11 years. He was not a politically sophisticated man. He did not think in terms of institutional strategy or leverage or documentation. He thought in terms of what was accurate and what wasn't, which was perhaps inevitable for someone who had spent more than a decade teaching people to shoot. When something was incorrect, it bothered him the way a crooked picture bothers certain people. Not philosophically, not morally, just viscerally, in a way he couldn't set aside. He had been at the range during week 9. He had been standing 12 feet from the target scoring station when Maren's 94.7 went into the system as 91.2. He hadn't said anything then either, but he'd written it down in the small green notebook he kept in his left breast pocket, the same notebook where he tracked equipment maintenance schedules and brass counts, and the names of candidates who needed extra coaching. He wrote it down because incorrect numbers were incorrect numbers, and he was not the kind of man who could leave incorrect numbers unaddressed indefinitely. They gave Maren 72 hours to clear her bunk and process out of the program housing. She spent the first evening sitting at the small desk in her room, going through her documentation one more time. Not because she doubted the accuracy of it. She never doubted the accuracy of things she had personally recorded, but because she wanted to understand what she actually had, what it amounted to, what it could do and what it couldn't. What she had was a record. That sounds simple. It wasn't simple. A record is not justice. A record is not a guarantee of anything. A record is a specific kind of thing. It is the gap between what happened and what was officially said to have happened, preserved in a form that can be shown to someone else. Whether that gap produces any consequence depends entirely on whether the someone else has the standing and the will to act on it. Maren knew this. She'd grown up in a family where her father was a union steward, and she'd watched him spend 20 years explaining to workers that being right wasn't enough. You had to be right and documented and in front of the correct set of eyes at the correct moment. She sent an email, one email to a single recipient, a name she'd found through 3 weeks of quiet research, a civilian investigator attached to the Department of Defense Inspector General's office, who had, in a report published 18 months earlier, written 6 sentences about documentation irregularities in a separate military training program. 6 sentences. Maren had read the full report 4 times. Those 6 sentences told her what she needed to know about what this particular person believed records were for. She attached 47 entries and went to sleep. She did not hear back for 11 days. In those 11 days, she reported to her reassigned post, a logistics coordination role that was, transparently, a placement designed to be forgettable, and she did the work without complaint. People who knew her from the program passed her in hallways and did the thing people do in those situations, which is look slightly to the left of her face and say nothing, because acknowledging what happened to someone requires either defending it or opposing it, and most people have decided in advance that neither is worth the cost. 2 people spoke to her directly. The first was a candidate named Petrie, who stopped her outside the mess hall on day 4 and said, quietly and without making eye contact, "For what it's worth, we all knew that evaluation was wrong." Maren thanked him. She didn't ask him to do anything else with what he knew, because she understood that knowing something and being willing to say it in a room with your name attached are 2 different things, and she wasn't in the business of pressuring people into positions they hadn't chosen. The second was Resnick. He found her at the end of her shift on day 7, standing in the gravel lot behind the equipment building, and he said without preamble, "I have a notebook." She looked at him for a moment. "I know," she said. He nodded. "Week 9. The 94.7, 91.2 in the system, I wrote it down the same day." There was a pause. Resnick was not a man who filled silence with unnecessary words, and Maren had learned early that silence was frequently more useful than speech. "I'd like to see what you have," she said. He handed her the notebook. What happened next did not happen quickly. This is important to say because the version of this story that travels well is the one where a single moment of truth cracks everything open and justice arrives like weather, sudden, unmistakable, cleansing. Real accountability doesn't move that way. Real accountability moves like water through stone, slowly, without drama, through the smallest available openings, wearing down resistance by persistence rather than by force. The IG investigator, her name was Pratt, and she had been doing this work for 14 years, reviewed Maren's documentation, cross-referenced it with Resnick's notebook, and filed a formal inquiry within the program's administrative structure. This produced, initially, a response from Calloway's office that characterized the discrepancies as clerical inconsistencies under review, and requested a 60-day window before any findings were finalized. Pratt denied the 60-day window and requested direct access to the raw scoring data from the range's electronic logging system. This is when Calloway made his first real mistake. Until this point, he had been operating in the comfortable territory of informal pressure, the kind of obstruction that leaves no fingerprints because it mostly consists of delays in paperwork and the ambient weight of institutional authority. When Pratt requested the electronic logs, he had two options: comply or escalate. He escalated. He contacted Harwick and suggested the inquiry was based on a disgruntled candidate's unsubstantiated claims and that engaging with it fully would damage program credibility. Harwick had signed Maren's dismissal order. He had done it because dismissal orders from Calloway's program came across his desk regularly, and he processed them without looking closely because that was the path of least resistance. And Harwick was a man who had built a career on finding paths of least resistance. But Harwick was not stupid, and he was not at his core corrupt. He was something more common and in some ways more dangerous, which was someone who had simply never been made to look directly at what he was enabling. Pratt's inquiry made him look. He read the documentation, the 47 entries, Resnick's notebook, the delta between a 94.7 and a 91.2, and the 23 other smaller discrepancies that surrounded it like evidence of a consistent pattern rather than an isolated error. He sat with it for 2 days. Then he contacted Pratt's office and told them he would cooperate fully. Calloway found out on a Thursday morning. The specific texture of that moment, what it felt like for a man who had controlled this particular environment completely for 6 years to understand that the environment was no longer under his control, is something that requires a certain kind of honesty to describe. It was not simple. It was not the clean collapse of a villain in a story where the moral lines are clear. Calloway had genuinely believed at some level that what he was doing was protecting the program, that a woman like Maren, capable, yes, undeniably capable, was nonetheless a disruption to something he had built and cared about, and that his job was to protect the thing he'd built. This is not a defense. It is an explanation of why people who do harm frequently don't experience themselves as doing it. The harm is real, regardless of the internal narrative. The 47 entries existed regardless of what Calloway believed about his own intentions. He was placed on administrative leave, pending the outcome of the formal inquiry. Breck was interviewed separately. The electronic scoring logs, when Pratt's office finally accessed them, contained metadata showing that Maren's Week 9 score had been manually altered. Not a clerical error, not a system glitch, but a deliberate change made from a terminal in Breck's office at 11:47 p.m. on the night of the evaluation. Breck resigned before the inquiry concluded. Calloway did not. The formal finding came in 9 weeks after Pratt's office began its investigation. Maren was notified by email, which was appropriate, not cold, just accurate to what the process was. The finding documented systematic scoring irregularities affecting her candidacy, concluded that her removal from the program had not been supported by accurate performance data, and recommended reinstatement with full candidacy credit for the weeks she had completed. It also recommended a review of 2 previous program dismissals. She read it twice. Then she set her phone face down on the desk and looked out the window for a while. The view was a parking lot. It was not a significant view, but she was not looking at the parking lot. She was doing the thing people do when something they've been holding tightly finally has somewhere to land. She was letting it settle. What she felt was not triumph. Triumph is for moments of conquest, and this was not that. This was something quieter and more complicated, the feeling of a record being corrected, of a number that had said 91.2 being returned officially to 94.7, of the gap between what happened and what was documented being formally closed. Her father had called her 2 weeks into the investigation to ask how she was doing. She'd told him the truth. "I'm fine. I'm waiting." He'd understood that. He'd said, "The record is patient if you are," which was the kind of thing he said slightly oracular, rooted in decades of watching institutional processes grind forward at their own speed. She'd written it down in her log. Entry 48. She returned to the program in the spring. The cohort she joined was 4 weeks in. She was briefed by a new range coordinator. Resnick had been formally commended and remained in his role, which was exactly where he belonged. And she began from week 5, carrying full credit for the weeks she'd already completed under documentation that now accurately reflected what she'd actually done. On her first day back on the range, she fired an 11-shot group at 800 meters that measured 3.2 inches center to center. The range coordinator, a taciturn man named Volmer, who had been doing this for 9 years and was not given to commentary, looked at the target for a moment and then wrote the number in the log. No adjustment, no delay. Just the number, accurate, entered in real time, attached to her name. She picked up her brass. She cleared her rifle. She walked back to the line. There's a specific thing that happens in institutions when one person decides the cost of silence is higher than the cost of speaking. Not an explosion, not a revolution, but a slow recalibration. Other people take note, not loudly, not all at once. But the example exists now, and examples have a way of persisting even when no one is talking about them directly. Petrie completed the program 6 months later and was assigned to a Special Operations Support Unit in the Pacific. He sent Maren a single text, "Passed. Thank you for not giving up." She didn't entirely understand what she'd done for him by not giving up. She hadn't done it for him. She hadn't done it for anyone except herself, and for the accuracy of a record that had been made wrong and needed to be made right. But courage doesn't ask to be understood before it travels. It just travels. Maren finished the program 8 weeks after her return with a final cumulative score that ranked second in the cohort, second, not first, because a candidate named Driscoll had shot a 97.1 on the final evaluation that was frankly extraordinary, and she had no problem acknowledging that. She acknowledged it because she was someone who believed in accurate numbers. She had 48 log entries that proved it.